everyone, this is KLMeri.
And this is Soda.
We have returned with the third and final podcast of Most Talked About Aliens. In the previous podcast, we covered aliens from their first appearances, order, starting with the original series, The Next Generation, and Deep Space Nine. So today we're going to wrap it up with Voyager and Enterprise. We will kick it off, of course, with Voyager. So,
Yeah.
Soda, knowing that we've talked about so many species in the last two podcasts, especially in the last podcast, there's one or two that I think make a reprisal in Voyager and Enterprise. So we'll touch on those, but I say let's start with the ones that are new.
In Voyager, in the cast of Voyager, we get, once again, we get a Vulcan and a Klingon on the crew, but we don't, because the premise of Voyager is that, they travel to the Delta Quadrant where Vulcans and Klingons aren't there, so we don't get too much, into the culture of Klingons or Vulcans.
Yeah.
But we are introduced on the first episode, on the pilot even, to two new characters from two different species, Delta Quadrant species. First is Neelix, who is Talaxian. The Talaxian have an interesting design, I guess. They do have a lot of rubber on them, rubber and fake fur.
Yeah.
But culture-wise, we don't really get that much about them. We do learn through Neelix that they had this big war, and Neelix lost some of his family in this war. But beyond that, we really don't get a lot about Talaxian culture.
I mean, I would agree. To be honest, I would have wanted to see a little more about that, but it didn't seem important to the storyline.
Yeah. It just didn't matter. Like, Neelix was this he was this comic relief character, I'll say. A lot of fans don't really like him. I'm among them. I don't really like Neelix. And aside from being comic relief, he didn't really have that much importance for most stories.
And I'd say in other shows, we have seen a pattern where there's an emphasis on different characters, even ones that are maybe not necessarily part of the main bridge crew, like in the limelight, so to speak. So usually they get at least one episode in the many seasons that air.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Well, a more interesting species is that of Neelix's girlfriend, Cass. Cass is an Ocampa, and in the pilot, the Voyager crew actually finds themselves on the Ocampa home planet. We do get quite a bit on the Ocampa. One interesting thing about the Ocampa is that, in Star Trek, you get a lot of species who are much longer lived than humans, who live, to be 150, 200, 300 years old. The Ocampa only live for 9 years.
Yeah.
Cass, when we meet her, she's an adult. She's only 2 years old, but she's an adult because, her species only lives for 9 years. The Ocampan culture was protected by the weird alien that brought Voyager to the Delta Quadrant, and then he died, and the Ocampan now have to learn to fend for themselves. They lived under the surface of their home planet. They weren't allowed to go on the surface. All the water and food was provided for them. They're very peaceful. They're kind of, they only live for 9 years, so they don't have too much time to create a lot of problems. We also later find out that some of them can live for a little longer. Some of them can live for 15 years and can develop certain psychic abilities.
Can I just say, the timeline of their aging process threw me off a little bit.
Yeah.
I suppose because if you're going to live, let's say 9 years, you would be middle-aged about 4.5 years. If you
Yeah.
just did it in a like what we would consider like a normal progression, supposedly they're only middle aged when they hit like 7 years. They've only got 2 years left.
Yeah.
On top of that, they're like their sexual maturity is not until 4 or 5 years.
Yeah.
It seems to me, I don't know if I'm wrong about this, but do they spend a more time in the childhood like development phase between years 1 and 4?
It is weird. We also find out that like they can only have one child. Like a woman can only have one child.
Yeah.
And it seems kind of, kind of detrimental to the reproduction of the species. Like if every
Yeah.
woman can have one child, that means that every couple can only have one child. That means for every two people who die, there's only one new person created. That's kind of, the population decreases. It doesn't increase.
Yeah.
It doesn't even stay the same. I think, one of the main criticisms of Voyager is that it wasn't very well written.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we are putting more thoughts into the Ocampa biology than the writers have. That's what I think.
Okay, a short-lived race, which means they have to develop faster. Yeah, I'm like you. I don't understand the one-child
Yeah,
rule.
and they also seem monogamous, which is,
Yeah. I mean, if we're going to get into it, it also just makes for like an uncomfortable situation because you have um, this person who looks full grown, but
yeah.
it's technically still a child in a sense of her race.
I don't think so. I mean, I don't think, Cass wasn't a child. She was an adult. I don't think, like, the ability to bear a child is one-to-one with the
Yeah.
concept of maturity. She was an adult according to the species. She looked like an adult. You
Yeah.
can't say she was a child. I don't like the way people say, "Oh, she was only 2 years old. She was she wasn't a child by her species." I mean, if the oldest person in her village was 9, which member of her species isn't a child?
Right. So I guess that's what confused me because she was 2
Yeah,
and supposedly they don't sexually mature until later. I guess it just like it flipped the concept of what, if we go by human biology, children, and then you begin to develop sexually, and you may still be a youth, and then eventually you're an adult. Whereas this is kind of flipped around. You might be an adult at 2 to your species, but like you guys don't consider having children until like 2 more years.
yeah.
So, and that's not even, but that's not middle aged. So it blew my mind, I guess you could say.
Well,
It
I,
was,
I think, in nature, in human real life nature, not in
yeah,
Star Trek, a lot of animals reach sexual maturity and they become sexually, able to have kids
yeah,
until very late in their life. And like old age is also a very short period of time. In a lot of animals, old age and childhood are very, very short periods of time. Humans are kind of strange in that regard.
yeah,
Um, and it makes sense, but it doesn't make sense if you're only able to have one child.
mm-hmm,
Because, the whole point is that you have a bigger, window of opportunity to have children, to reproduce.
mm-hmm. And you might have multiple children at one time if you're an animal species. Yeah,
Yeah. So I think the whole point of them was, the whole 9 years rule was that we meet her too, and the fact that, it kind of became the norm for a Star Trek series to have 7 seasons. Every season is roughly a year. The point was either that by the end of the series she'll die of old age, or they'll find like a way to make her live, longer life, a longer lifespan.
mm-hmm.
That's what I figured.
And I thought at some point there was a comment made that as they continue to reproduce, even though they're only having like one child per couple, um, that trait for them to develop very rapidly was was a dominant trait, but then the more generations they had, the less dominant the trait became. And I was wondering if they were leading into them living more than 9 years.
Maybe.
I don't know. Just seemed a very strange thing to throw out there.
Yeah.
If you didn't intend to start expanding the lifespan of the race.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, so we have the Ocampa. Unfortunately, Cass did not, stay on for the whole run of the series. She was over and done with by the end of season 3, I think. We got a guest appearance of her in either late season 4 or season 5. I can't remember right now.
Well, yeah, you're asking the wrong person.
Yeah. I don't, I actually kind of liked Cass. I didn't like what they did with her in the story. Kind of dismissed her. Voyager was supposedly this, this Star Trek with more female characters, but they still had to kick off Cass to have 7 of 9. Apparently, the limit is 3 female characters.
That's so true.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, those are the Ocampa. They are not very interesting. They didn't catch on. I can't say that any of the species introduced in Voyager caught on.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think the worst offenders, though, were the villains, shall we say, of the early seasons, which were the Kazon. Some people call them cabbage heads because that's what they look like. Yeah, the Kazon are basically... They're a species of people who used to be sort of a slave species, who overpowered their masters and took over the ships. And you'd think that would make them kind of heroic, but the stories make them kind of boorish and stupid. The ships that they stole are in constant state of disrepair. They can't fix them, they don't know how, and they never learn. It's just, they are very, very violent, and they use brutal force most of the time, and they're very, they don't have any empathy for anyone. They're just a very, very unpleasant people to be around. And it's interesting that those are the people that Star Trek decided to make, the escaped slave species.
Okay, the escaped slave species. And I know it's not the same as the Bajorans.
Yeah.
But it gave me that feel because the Bajorans were the oppressed race.
Yeah.
During the occupation. A slave race is different, but it just kind of gave me like, is that why you're doing this? I don't know.
It's possible. I read somewhere they were supposed to be analogous to actually to gangs in America at the time, the Bloods and the Crips or whatever. Yeah. It was, if that was the case, it's such a terrible analogy. I don't even know what to say about it. Like, why would you do that?
Yeah, I guess with the Kazon, they just didn't seem very well organized to me, but I thought, well, of course not. They were like a subjugated race. Once they're no longer a subjugated race, like, would they have their own... How well developed would they be with, like, their own government and leadership? And, I mean, they had an order, but...
Yeah, they had an order of basically gangs, roaming gangs.
Yeah.
And they were basically like a sort of a mob. Like, they were taking protection money from various planets and businesses, and robbing people, and generally just being kind of bad as a species.
So bad that the Borg rejected them.
Yeah.
We cannot assimilate you. You're too unremarkable. Got nothing going for you.
Exactly. They didn't even have their own technology. All their technology was stolen from the species that enslaved them. And I think the most egregious part is that we yet to meet the species that enslaved them at a certain episode. And they are presented as like these nice, smart people that we're supposed to root for. And it's like, which is like, what are you doing?
Oh my gosh.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, the Kazon are bad at every way you look at it. They are bad. They are badly written. They are boring as a species. They are one-dimensional. Just there's nothing to do with them. Absolutely nothing. And I guess this is why we kind of stopped seeing them after the second season. They just kind of disappear, never appear again, because I guess even the writers realized they are bad. There is no saving this. Another species that gets introduced in the early seasons and actually does stick around for quite a bit are the Vidiians.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. The Vidiians are a species that are an interesting. Actually, they are an interesting species. I kind of like the concept of them. They are a very technologically advanced species who was stricken with a certain disease that basically makes their organs fail, and they are in constant need of new organs. But because their entire species was infected, they can't really harvest from each other, so they send bounty hunters throughout the galaxy to harvest other species for organs. And of course, they're constantly occupied with trying to find a cure for the disease that attacked them.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah. That's the concept. Every time we encounter them, they are trying to find a new solution for their sickness.
Yeah.
There was... we basically find out that Klingons are immune to the sickness. And the solution for the species could be found with Klingons.
Good luck with that.
Yeah, good luck with that, because the way they try to do it is the way they try to harvest organs, which is to kidnap the only Klingon in the Delta Quadrant, which is B'Elanna Torres on Voyager.
Exactly. I will say Klingons have spare organs, so
yeah,
maybe you could just start a trade.
I mean, we could. But yeah, they try to get this medicine by,
Mm-hmm.
force, which
Right.
doesn't go over. It wouldn't go over well with the Klingons. Let's say that. But it doesn't go over well with Voyager either. But it is an interesting concept. I like this concept. It's creative.
Mm-hmm. It's just, yeah, at least it's not unremarkable like the previous race.
They, because they're aliens, it's not like every species has the organs they need. So they developed a way to kidnap people and change their DNA so that they'll develop the organs that they'll need, and then they harvest them. It's an interesting concept.
It's definitely a very sci-fi concept.
Yeah.
Are we moving on?
Well, there are two more species we should talk about in Voyager, yeah.
Is the Ktarians one of them?
Oh, remind me who those are?
I don't know why they popped in my head. I think it's because I was like, oh yeah, there was that species where they had the horizontal, like, cat eye slit.
I don't remember them at all.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I mean, well, I guess they were in 2 episodes.
Oh, yeah. That'll do.
Actually, they might have even been mentioned in The Next Generation. I can't remember. I think we've seen a couple that were part of Starfleet. There's one, Naomi somebody, who is a hybrid between a human and a Ktarian. But I think the one we saw in Voyager had this, like, bulbous forehead. That, I think, is what stood out to me. And suffice to say, I don't think they took any time to develop them other than to say they were part of the coalition of planets, and at some point they tried to take over, like, Fleet and made some kind of weird, like, mind control technology. Even though they're, like, officially part of the Federation, they sympathize with anti-Federation races. It is very strange. They popped up in different episodes and never really got much development other than some throwaway stuff. Like, they have, like, a heart with 8 chambers, or They can make weird sounds that sound like the ship engines or something. I'm not surprised you don't remember them.
I have no recollection of them at all. Just, yeah.
Okay, but the only thing that I ever remembered them by was actually, I think, from the Next Generation, was that they had like yellow eyes and they had these slits, but like cat eyes, but they were not vertical. Like the pupil was not vertical, it was horizontal.
Like goats?
Yeah.
Interesting.
And actually, they kind of did make them like ghosts. They had some kind of. They had like a cranial ridge that went up from like the top of the nose brow up to the forehead, but it was little like teeny horns. Yeah.
I have I don't remember them at all.
Anyway, obviously they were not remarkable. It's a memorable from an alien species standpoint, but they were introduced as Starfleet crew, I think, in the Next Generation, and then they like showed up a couple of times in Voyager.
Interesting.
But they're definitely not the most talked about, so maybe I should have even spent the few minutes talking about them.
No, actually, Voyager did introduce discuss a lot of new species because of the setting,
In Delta Quadrant. Yeah.
Just most of them did not get any sort of development. And you just made me remember another species that appeared like maybe once or twice. Species 8472. That's their name.
Oh, yeah.
They're like this non-human species from a different dimension, and they're the only species the Borg are afraid of. Which makes them, I think that's the most remarkable thing about them. They're like not from this dimension. They're trans-dimensional or something like that. Mm-hmm. We never really see how they look like, but they're kind of there. Their presence is there. Mm-hmm. Just as a concept, it's interesting because the Borg are afraid of them.
Yeah, that's one of those things. You could make that comment and then later bring them back and make them more interesting in another episode, but I don't think that ever happens.
Yeah, no, it never happens.
And I think it's the same thing with the Ktarians. Like, they had a Borg designation too. Like, they had a species number, according to the Borg, so they were interesting enough to assimilate, yet I don't think the writers ever decided to spend any more time developing them than to say, like, their allegiances with the Federation, but kind of not. So, yeah. Maybe they intended to do something with them later on and they just never got to it.
Yeah. Well, the last species I want to talk about that it was introduced in Voyager is the Hirogans. I can't say they are remarkable. They're just kind of discount Klingons, I'll call them. They're just kind of very fighty and about honor. Their gimmick, what shall we say, is about the hunt. They're hunters. They hunt things. That's it. They really are. Every time the story needed some sort of, British alien who fights a lot, the Hirogens were there for that. They really are just the discount Klingons.
I just love that term, the discount Klingons.
Yeah, they're discount Klingons. There's no other way.
It's like we didn't need them to be the discount Orion, the pirates of the series, but we did need like this hunter warrior knockoff, Klingon knockoff race, and so we gave it to these guys.
Exactly. That's exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly it.
But I think we all know that the main is not even a villain, but what was a villain in the Next Generation is explored more in Voyager.
Yeah, they're kind of still villains, but they become more complicated.
Yeah.
Yeah, Voyager developed the Borg. They developed the Borg more than any other species. Some say to their detriment, because a lot of the Borg when they were introduced were very scary, and Voyager made them very not scary.
Yeah, which they basically took that Borg concept and, as you said, developed it because they introduced a new crew member, 7 of 9.
Yeah, the thing is about 7 of 9, she is a very good character, I think. But, we had this concept of a Borg who can be deborged, shall we say, in the next generation. We had, Picard was assimilated and then was deborged, and we had Hugh, the Borg, who, was rescued. But it was kind of, up in the air if Hugh is really ever going to be, not Borg. And the thing about Picard was this: Picard was assimilated, for a very short time, so it made a little bit of sense. But Seven of Nine was very much a Borg. She was a Borg. She has been a Borg for years now. And the thing is that when you start to say, oh, you can deborgify most Borgs, is that the concept of, becoming a Borg becomes less scary. It's still kind of scary, but it becomes a lot less scary.
That's the thing about when the Borgs were first presented in the Next Generation. They were supposed to be like the ultimate enemy. The thing that's like the thing in the dark that scared you because you thought they were undefeatable.
Exactly. And the concept of the Borg Queen was introduced in the Next Generation movie First Contact. It made sense there because you can't. In the Next Generation, the show, the Borg were like a hive mind. They didn't have a queen, but the role of the queen was like kind of like to represent the Borg. So the villain will have a face in the movie. But in the show, it just kind of became like this weird power struggle between the Borg Queen and Janeway, and like if a random Starfleet captain, because Janeway may be an interesting character, but she's just a random Starfleet captain.
Yeah.
And if she's on the same level as the Borg Queen, the Borg are very not scary. I'm very sorry, it just makes the Borg very not scary. I mean, Voyager constantly outsmarts the Borg, outthinks them, outmaneuvers them, and when a random Starfleet ship can do that, it makes the Borg look not that scary, not very weak.
Yeah. I think that's it for Voyager, isn't it?
Yeah, like we said, there are a lot of random species that pop up here and there, but most of them only get an episode or two.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So shall we switch over to Star Trek Enterprise?
Yeah.
I'd say this time let's kind of flip it around. Let's talk about the race that we already knew of.
Yeah.
That they expanded more in Enterprise.
Yeah. Well, first of all, Star Trek Enterprise is kind of in a unique position, being a prequel.
Yeah.
Because it couldn't have introduced too many new species, otherwise we would wonder, well, where are they now? Why do we only see them in the past? So it was a smart move, I say, to expand on existing species that we don't know as much about. And the species that they got to expand about the most is actually the Andorians.
Yep.
Yeah.
Through a really excellent character.
Yeah, the very great Shran. Yeah, actually, the interesting part is Shran appears in 7, 9 episodes, something like that.
Yeah.
He doesn't appear that much, but he makes such an impact. You remember him. He's a lot of people's favorite character.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's just how they used the vehicle to deliver more Andorian content, and him being essentially a commander, of the Andorians in their military, it just provided the means to give a lot more backstory. The fight with the Vulcans, between the Andorians and the Vulcans, things like that you would have never learned about in the original series.
Yeah, that's true. We get to see the Andorian home planet, which is very nice. We see there is an Andorian subspecies of albino blind Andorians who also have telepathic abilities.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The Anar.
The Anar, exactly. And we do learn quite a bit about Andorian culture. How they fight with carving tools or whatever.
Oh yeah. Well, yes, they're again, and I think I mentioned this in the original series podcast when we talked about them. They're meant to not look very strong in appearance, but they're supposedly extremely strong, and
Yeah,
yeah, they can take you in a fight.
yeah, yeah. And we learn about their honor system. They're not, they're not very welcoming of strangers, but they are very, you become their friends, they're very honorable and they will defend you.
Helping you attack a common enemy, which we'll get to.
Yeah. So yeah, the Andorians were developed. We also got a little bit of development for, well, not development per se, but we got to know more about Vulcans in this series.
Mm-hmm.
We do learn how the first steps of Vulcan-human relations went, which not great. It wasn't great. But it is interesting to see. I think they made a very interesting turn about it, because in other Star Trek series they made it sound like, we became best friends.
Right. First contact was beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No. But Enterprise is like, no, we took some time. We didn't really trust Vulcans at first, and they didn't trust us. They saw us, acting like idiots, and we saw them as stuck-up snobs.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And, even before the days of them, joining together, like all of them joining together to create the Federation, even when they had agreed to make some joint efforts to do a little exploring, they all very much operated very independently. I mean, this is why you had the Vulcan High Council decides they're going to invade Andoria. Okay? Yeah. You would not expect that from a Federation era Vulcan race.
Yeah.
Invasion and Vulcans in the same sentence seem kind of weird.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, this is one of the ways we get to see Shran, in the Enterprise, because Vulcan is trying to invade Andoria.
Exactly. There's a lot of tension between the Vulcans and Andorians.
Yes.
Which ironically might be one of the reasons that Andorians and humans became closer friends, because we could bond over how much we don't like the Vulcans.
Well, it's just another example of how Archer owed Shran.
Yeah.
For his intervention or his, assistance.
Yeah. Well, the Enterprise crew is probably the most, homogeneous in terms of species. Apart from the Vulcan, Vulcan second in command, we have another member of a different species, a new species, Denobulans.
Yes.
Or Dr. Flux, which is actually a really good character. He's often forgotten. I don't know why. He's a good character. He's a lot more memorable than other crew members that I can name. Yeah, but Denobulans are they're cute. The main shtick, the main gimmick is the fact they're polyamorous, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
Or polygamous. Every one of them has several wives and husbands and whatnot. They have very intricate connections with each other, shall we say.
Okay, when he had screen time, it was interesting.
Yeah.
But it was another one of those, it felt kind of there for comedic relief.
Yeah, that's true.
Personally, I would have wanted to learn a whole lot more about that particular race. And to be honest, I don't really recall, but why was his race also a part of this joint venture?
He's not his race specifically. It's just that he's if I remember correctly, he was a doctor on Earth who specifically studied xenobiology.
That's right.
And offered his services on this mission.
Yeah. I guess I never really questioned it too much at the time, but in hindsight, this particular race was never called out as one of the founders of the Federation.
No, and we never really got a reason why, because
exactly.
we see them take an active part in a lot of things.
Yeah, but they're there in, like pre-Federation days and part of this crew, and I don't know. That implies that they were known to Turians, like they had one of their doctors on their planet on Earth.
Yeah, yeah,
So, which implies they might have been working with them, back in the like Romulan War days.
yeah. I mean, we also never get a mention of them in later Star Trek series. And
Right.
we know this because they weren't invented until Enterprise. But when you look at it from an in-universe perspective, I think I have a theory that maybe something happened to them during the Romulan War, and
Okay.
that's why they. That's just my theory. I never saw any proof of that, but it would make sense if maybe the Romulan War, their planet was hit and most of their species died off or something like that.
Okay, so bear with me here. But
Yeah.
wasn't there a mention wasn't it the original series that it might have come from Scotty and his fight with the Klingons, when they were insulting the Enterprise? But didn't they say something like a Denebian slugworm?
Yeah, but the Nibian and Denobulan are in the same word.
I know they're not the same, but is it possible that they took that Denebian whatever, which they never actually defined in the original series as any particular, and then just tweaked it a little bit and made it this species for Enterprise?
I have no idea. I mean, everything is possible, but because it's not the same word, I'm going to say it's not the same species.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I do. I actually do think maybe something happened to their species before the Federation even formed, so they didn't even join in, didn't have a chance, which would be sad. But it's an explanation.
I mean, who knows? They may be resurrected in future Star Trek. It happens.
Yeah, it happens. Yeah, the main species that Enterprise introduced is actually the Xindi.
Yeah.
The Xindi were also the big bads of most of season 3.
Yes.
Yeah. The interesting part about the Xindi is that while they're all part of the same race, they also have they are composed of 5 different species.
Like the aquatic and the the primate and
you have the primates, the insectoids, the aquatic,
reptilians.
reptilians, and there was another one.
The avian, the bird.
No, the avian died off.
Oh, well, the avian died off, but they were.
They were, but there was another one that wasn't the avians, and I forgot about it.
Yeah, the ones that kind of looked like Tellarites but had a lot of hair.
Yeah, those.
I don't know what they're supposed to represent.
I don't know. Mammalians. I don't know. Anyway, yeah, those are the 5 main.
Like arborillians or something. I don't know.
Something like that. Yeah, basically there are 5 species that are really the same race. They're from the same planet. They just look different. And they all speak.
Well, to be fair, the primates looked an awful more like, humanoid appearance.
Yeah. And the interesting thing, I think it's an interesting concept because a lot of times, that's what happens when you're even on the same planet. There are different areas, and the same kind of animal can develop in very different ways in different areas. That's what happened here. They also speak different languages. They have kind of different cultures. Their story is that their planet, the planet was kind of destroyed. It was destroyed by them, basically.
A civil war.
Yeah, between different races. And as you said, the avians, they used to have an avian species that died off during this war. And ever since then, they kind of spread out throughout the galaxy. And in Enterprise, there's an intricate story in the 3rd season about them kind of starting a war with Earth because of a plot that involves time travel and stuff. It's very complicated, and I don't remember all of it. But it's interesting because the two species of the Xindi, the reptoid and the insectoid, are very much invested in creating this war, while the primates and the other mammalian species kind of aren't really that excited about it, and the aquatics are kind of indifferent.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think it's interesting that the show chose to have the two species that look the least like humans be more for the war, and those that look more like humans be less for the war.
Right.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you've got your aggressive, like, the reptilians and the insectoids that, like, look more of, like, the monster category.
Yeah, the monstrous ones, the ones that look like monsters.
They're the aggressive ones,
evil.
Of course.
They're the evil, aggressive ones, and the ones that look more like humans are the nice ones. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Again, it kind of runs into the same problem as the Denobulans of why we never hear about them anymore.
I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a great question. Maybe, I don't know.
Maybe they fought again and killed each other? What happened there? Why did the Xindi disappear?
Whatever these guardians were that they worshipped took them away.
Yeah. Could be.
Yeah.
We do learn quite a bit about them and their culture because the entire third season is kind of about them. It's just, the thing about Enterprise that after the second season, it was, it was in a world that was post 9/11, and American shows took a very militaristic turn in general. So I think Enterprise started as a one thing and turned into a very different thing. And the third season is a very good example of that.
Mm-hmm.
Because the first two seasons were kind of, there was hints about a conflict between Andorians and Romulan and the Vulcans. And we knew the Romulan war was going to happen at some point, but it was still about, the making of the Federation, making peace. And then we have the first season and suddenly it's all about war.
And I was reading a little bit about this to jog my memory, and something I didn't know was they brought in this like war concept in the third season because it was sort of a response to what had happened with 9/11 in America, and the terrorist attacks. And so the Xindi were kind of brought forward as, reflective of the terrorism that was going on at the time. And so now you have this race that is attacking like different parts of Earth. Yeah. Yeah. I thought that was interesting. I'm not sure how well that resonated with the audience at the time, but yeah.
Well, if we look at the statistics, viewing statistics, not very well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing I learned was that they were originally going to be like just another one villain race. And then somebody had an idea, well, what if several different species on the same planet developed to represent the race? With to the same level of like intelligence. Anyway, long story short, the big bad of season 3.
Yeah.
The Xindi.
Bad. They do try to like humanize them in a few episodes, but mostly the primate ones.
Well, yeah, the ones that look most like humanoids.
What else? Well, I mean, as I said, Enterprise didn't run for very long. It only had 4 seasons.
Mm-hmm.
We do get a little bit about Tellarites, but not a lot. I get a feeling that if we got another season, we would get a lot more of Tellarites and Andorians, and probably more Romulans too.
Yeah.
But other than that, I really can't think of anything.
So we've covered Voyager, we've covered Enterprise. obviously those are the main Star Trek shows before recent times where they've introduced newer series.
Yeah.
And Soda and I get a chance, we will, we might go down the path of looking at some of the newer shows, but we have to give them time to run their course, so to speak, before we might take a look at some of the same topics, like the newly introduced alien species. I mean, off the top of my head, I can think of a good one off Discovery.
Yeah.
For all intents and purposes, we wanted to talk about those that are most well known to the fandom.
Yeah. Exactly. And we covered those. And I personally, I think I have a question for you.
Yeah.
I think we can both agree that the two shows that introduce the most alien species are Next Generation and Deep Space Nine.
Yes.
Would you rather have more, broad concept introductions like Next Generation, or more deep dive into existing species like Deep Space Nine?
It's a tough question because for me it goes back to format of the shows themselves. I mean, you have a Next Generation, you've basically got a ship that's traveling around and meeting new species.
Yeah.
And that's how you get these broader concepts introduced. But in Deep Space Nine, you've got a station where a lot of people come through, and some people stay for long periods of time, and then that's where you get to really develop them. I think Deep Space Nine is my preference, like that style, because I have found the most value out of getting to know a species really well. And, even for some of the ones that, have been around a long time, like the Vulcans, some of that has remained a mystery, or they just never, like, truly developed them to the point that they were, like, you knew everything about them. But they did get a chance to do that in Deep Space Nine.
Yeah.
I appreciate that more, I think. It provides a richness to what is essentially a conglomeration of different alien races interacting with each other in space.
Yeah. There's part of me that agrees, but another part of me is like, I worry that too much development in the style of Deep Space Nine humanizes species too much. Like I see, what happened to the Borg in Voyager. And I don't want too many alien species that are closer to humans.
I mean, I see that point. I certainly don't want more human-like races.
Yeah.
I mean, that defeats the purpose of them being foreign and being completely different than what we know, because we know ourselves very well. But at the same time, I also don't want like a throwaway race from an episode, like the Trills, or goodness, what they did with the Ferengi in the Next Generation.
Oh yeah, that's just
In the style of the Next Generation, I don't want it to be like I developed them just to be the bad guy of the episode. And you could have done more, and then you could have made them really, really interesting, like Deep Space Nine did with the Ferengi. But I think, to your point, it could go too far, because then you take something that is beloved as it is and kind of retcon it, or, as you said, make it seem less interesting than what it was originally intended to be, like Voyager did with the Borg. So it's just examples of how they've done too little or too much. So I beg of you, Star Trek, just do it at just the right amount. Like the Klingons.
Like the Klingons. I think, this is relevant in the new shows to what they're doing in Strange New Worlds.
Yeah.
To the,
Oh, the Gorn?
Forgot the Gorn. Yeah, the Gorn.
I was like, oh, wait, yes, no, the retconning of the Gorn.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I hope it leads somewhere good. I mean, so far, Strange New Worlds have been very good, but, we're only one season in. But yeah, I really hope they don't either over villainize them or overdevelop them
Mm-hmm.
in a way that feels unrealistic. Well, not unrealistic, but you know, that
Yeah.
distracts from their point, shall we say.
Mm-hmm. This is more of a philosophical question. Do we really need the ultimate villains, like the ultimate villain race, in a Star Trek show?
I can see why we would need them. Actually, I can see why they could be an interesting threat to have around. I don't think we need an outright villain species. Like that's why I think the Kazon didn't work because they were just literally just bad guys. There was nothing to them.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's interesting when a species is bad guys because of their the values clashing with the Federation, but they're not like actively out there seeking Federation ships to blow up. The Borg also weren't out there like, looking for Federation ship to assimilate. They just went about their business, and if a Federation ship got in the way, they did what they did. But yeah, when a species becomes sole purpose becomes being a villain, I think it's bad.
Yeah.
But if they are a long time kind of villain because of the story they come from, then it's interesting. I enjoy that.
So what I'm hearing is kind of the formula of the original series worked well because you had the Klingons and like the Romulans and again these races that just whatever they were up to, the things that they value clashed with the agenda of the Federation.
Yeah.
Or the moral stance that the Federation took on certain things, but they weren't always so prevalent that they just showed up to ruin the day because they could and because
Yeah.
yeah, but and it also allowed the show to take time for them to do the exploring that they were meant to and to go around and meet these other new races and then occasionally have the thorn in their side show up. To me that was always like the perfect balance. I think I think what worried me about like Strange New Worlds was we have a similar setup. This ship is out exploring and doing different things, but we have the Gorn who's the thorn in the side, but they're more like the Borg.
Yeah.
Um, like they're off doing their own thing, but it's becoming a real and present threat to the Federation. Um,
Yeah.
and I just don't know that I want to spend more of my time focusing on the real and present danger, or I kind of want to go back to the alien race of the day of the episode.
Yeah. I think, well, like you said, in the original series, we had the Klingons and the Romulans. I think the Romulans kind of stayed in that part for the most part,
Yeah,
up until Picard, basically.
yeah,
I don't like what Picard did with the Romulans. I don't think it was good. But yeah, I think I said before what I don't like about what's happening with the Gorn in Strange New World. I think is a concept of a villain species that's kind of out there doing their own thing, but becomes a problem because the Federation is getting bigger. That's an interesting concept.
mm-hmm.
But the concept of the Gorn my problem is that I thought the concept of the Gorn in the original series was more interesting than what they're doing right now. I mean, they still have a chance to turn it around, but I thought it was more interesting in the original series when they were this monstrous, violent on the surface, but that's because we didn't know how to talk to them.
Right, and we didn't know like we were on in their territory. We're just kind of
Yeah.
like blundering our way through, and like you said, it's a lack of communication. That's obviously a huge issue in what's going on in Strange New Worlds, right? With the
Yeah.
Gorn, they just cannot communicate with them. But they have made it seem like the Gorn are completely unreasonable to deal with, and
Yeah.
they're they don't want to talk to you, even if you could talk to them, because they're just intent
Exactly.
on eating you.
Exactly. They made it seem like they're impossible to communicate with. It's
Right.
not that there's just no way right now, just they're impossible. They don't want to communicate.
Yeah. There could be a chance to turn around. Maybe they realize maybe the Gorn will only not eat you if they can feel like you are at their level. you're an
Yeah.
intelligent race who can fight with them at their level, you're a predator too. So they only want to eat the prey, and if you can convince them you're not prey, they'll leave you alone.
Maybe. Who
Maybe.
knows?
That's the only way I see out of it.
Yeah, I mean, also Stranger Worlds is kind of limited by the fact that we that we have the original series. It's also a prequel.
Yeah.
So we'll see. We'll see.
Can't be like the Xindi where they just disappear and they never hear
Yeah.
from them again because obviously,
Obviously we do.
yeah, we do. That's pretty much it for this podcast. I mean, we talked about so many races. We talked about the most popular, probably the most forgettable.
Yeah. Yes, we did.
All the villains that were introduced across the different shows. And yeah, as always, as Star Trek fans, we're always looking for more new fun races, species introduced in Star Trek.
Yes. And you always want to know more about established species that we don't know anything about.
Yeah, sure. Give us new information, as long as it doesn't upset what we already think we know about them.
Yeah.
Thanks everyone for listening, and we'll be back with another podcast closer to the holidays. So, until then.
Goodbye, everybody.